Hey YouTube, Tom Hewson with Tom Hewson Photography here, and in this video is going to be part 3 of the exposure triangle videos, and it is going to be on ISO. However, before I get there, I'll recap the other two. So part 1 was on aperture, which is how much light your lens can let through it due to the diameter of the diaphragm. And then in part 2, it was on shutter speed, which is how fast the shutter opens and closes, which controls how much light actually gets from the lens and hits the sensor. And then in this video, I'm going to talk about ISO. ISO is an old term from film photography, which was the speed of the film, or how sensitive the film was to light. So ISO 200 film was the least sensitive to light usually, or ISO 100 depending on the film. And that meant that you could take pictures on a bright sunny day and it wouldn't be overexposed. Whereas you could get film that was ISO 800 or 400 or higher, and that was really sensitive to light, and you would use that for nighttime photos or indoor photos where there isn't a lot of light. However, in the age of digital photography, the sensor, you can control its ISO just with a roll of your buttons. So ISO is how sensitive the sensor is now to light. So ISO 200 is not very sensitive, and then the higher up you make your ISO, the more sensitive your sensor gets to light. And that is how ISO controls the exposure of your photos. However, just as shutter speed and aperture control other variables of your photos, ISO does too. ISO controls how much noise or grain there is in your photos. Grain and noise are the same thing. It is how pixelated basically your photos get, and they get more noisy or more grainy or more pixelated the higher your ISO is. It is just what happens when you increase the sensitivity of your sensor. So in this photo, this is an example of a very noisy photo. This was at a concert from the Weakerthans. It was taken with a point-and-shoot camera, and for it to get a well-exposed photo, it had to really bump up the ISO, which made my photos really grainy and really noisy. The rule for ISO that I follow is to keep your ISO as low as your camera can make it in its native range. So most cameras now, when you control the ISO, it will go from its native range, which is all of the numbers, so 200 for the D90s to 3200. However, if you go past 3200, it says high 0.3, high 0.7, and high 1. Those are expandable settings and not the native settings, and it's the same for going below 200. That's getting into areas where your photos really will not look good, and it will definitely take away from your image quality. So I always advise to stay in the native range, so 200 and up to whatever, or 100 up to whatever, and don't go below or above the actual numbers. And I also advise to stay at the lowest number possible. This ensures that your photos will be very sharp and will not have noise. Now, different cameras control noise in varying amounts. The D90, if I shot it at anything above 800, I would get pretty significant noise. Whereas now with my D600, which is filming this video, it is actually currently filming at ISO 1600, which is twice as sensitive to light and should be very grainy, and is very grainy on the D90. However, because that is a full frame sensor and a much better and newer sensor, it can handle the noise very well. So on newer, better sensors, and especially full frame sensors, you can really bump the ISO up very high before it becomes an issue. Some cameras you can bump it up so high that and they're so advanced with their sensors that you actually don't really notice it that much. With the D600, for example, I can bump it up to 3200, which is as high as my Nikon D90 can go, and the photos are usable. I wouldn't shoot that high, however, I have gotten some shots at ISO 3200 that I have one of them on my website actually. So with ISO, it controls how sensitive your sensor is to light, and therefore how bright or how dark your photos are. However, to brighten your photos using your ISO, it comes at a cost, usually with your image quality. So I always recommend to change your ISO last, and that is what I will go over in my next video on using aperture, shutter speed, and ISO together to expose and create your photos. So I hope this helps. If you have any questions about ISO, shutter speed, or aperture, please let me know and I'll be more than happy to help you out. If it is a big question, I can usually make it into a video like this. So again, I hope this helps. You can read over this, as I've said in my other two videos, in my blog as well, if that is easier. And my next video would be on using them together. Cheers.